Hello and welcome to my channel, or welcome back to my channel. My name is Johan and I'm a Dutchie, and I'm learning about life and living in Australia because it's way down there, down under. And I'm afraid of flying, so the only way to really learn about life and living in Australia is watching and reacting to videos of this on YouTube and together with my community, because the community is really growing, giving me all kinds of feedback about how it actually is in Australia, so I'm loving it. And for today I want to take a look at the video of the full history of Australia. This is a documentary, and it's a rather lengthy one of 43 minutes. So yeah, I want to do this, maybe not for everybody who's used to my channel, that I do some smaller, not that long videos. But if I want to learn about Australia, I need to learn how it came to. So the history of Australia is a really important part of the learning process of what's happening in Australia. And I already know, because being Dutch, we were the first. We were the first people that went there. We call it New Holland, and we walked away. We left it, as in, not important. It's one big desert. And then the British came over, and they say, well, it's good for a penal colony. Let's colonize this island continent. So what's going on? Now, let's take a look about the full history of Australia. It's gonna be a long one. Struggle is the Architect of the Soul by James Cook. Okay, struggle is the architect of the soul. Yeah, okay. You learn when you have to do something that's not that easy to learn. Yeah.
It is a land shaped by a dynamic and incredible history. A land which is a mix of that which is appreciably familiar.
I have to adjust the volume a bit.
To the rest of the world, but also totally exotic, with elements not seen anywhere else. The culture indigenous to this land, one of the oldest in the world, developed in not total but very heavy isolation from the rest of the human race, making it distinct from anything seen elsewhere. In the 17th century, however, a new group arrived on the scene: the Europeans. Initially, they would disregard the island, which is nearly the size of the whole continent, until one group found opportunity in it: the British. They would
Dutch history here, proclaiming it was the New Holland. It's colonized, but we were the first. I object to this kind of forgotten history of Australia.
Embark on a period of settlement and conquest, creating the modern nation state with which we are familiar.
The same happened, by the way, because I was thinking about it. The same happened in the United States. It was New Amsterdam before it became New York. And nobody is mentioning that the Dutchies were really a big part of winning the Civil War for the Americans, not only the French. So we are left conveniently out of some of the biggest parts in history. Because we had a very dark history.
It would not be easy, however, and a huge number of challenges, both internal and external, awaited them there, which would draw into question the country's ability to survive at all. Hello and welcome to Fire of Learning. This is the Fifth World, the Southern Land, or in Latin, Terra Australis. This is the full history of Australia. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us as we now add Australia to the list of nations and peoples whose history we have fully covered in our documentary series. There will be no part 2 to this video. We will be doing it all in one sitting. I'm proud to announce as well that this is our 10th History of Nations and Peoples nation. 10 down and a whole world to go. Before we begin, I would like to
Santia.
thank, and as always I'll do my best with the names, Albin Pay, or Pays, Michelin Desergev, David Alloy, Chad Prentice, LD, Sonaram, Sebastian Drouin, or Sebastian Drouin, Trevor Young, Everett Rosendahl, Odd Draken, Crabface McGrouch, William Lingenfelter, and Mark Triner for being our most recent supporters on Patreon. They join these supporters who make these videos possible. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit the like button and consider subscribing for more videos like this in the future. Now then, let's get to it.
Let's get to it. The first Australians. Okay.
The term Indigenous Australian refers to both Aboriginal Australians and the Torres Strait Islanders, who are separate ethnic groups. The Torres Strait Islanders have only a population of around 4,000 in the modern day and inhabit the islands of the Torres Strait in between Australia and New Guinea.
Oh, that's new for me. Okay. The Torres Strait. Oh, and how, I have to go back now.
Torres Strait Islanders have
Torres Strait Islanders. That's the name. The Torres Strait Islanders. Okay.
only a population of around 4,000 in the modern day and inhabit the islands of the Torres Strait in between Australia and New Guinea. Aboriginal Australians are the native inhabitants of mainland Australia and Tasmania. To understand them, we must briefly go quite far back in time. Researchers believe that the first humans made their way to Australia around 50 to 60,000 years ago, perhaps even before this. This was thousands of years before the first humans set foot in Europe, the Americas, or Northern Asia. In this time, sea levels were far lower by about 400 feet, and a land bridge existed throughout much of Southeast Asia. It did not directly connect Australia to the land, but made the distances between the islands much smaller, thus facilitating movement. These peoples, therefore, are believed to have been some of the first seafaring peoples. It is unclear if the migration occurred in only a single wave or multiple, and thus when this period of migration ended is unknown. Most Aboriginal Australians appear to have diverged from other groups, such as the people of New Guinea, around 36,000 years ago. The sea levels rose to around current levels around 6,000 years ago. It seems that within the past 6,000 years, however, there has been a degree of pre-European contact, primarily, or perhaps exclusively, in the north of Australia. Evidence suggests that there was contact and genetic influence from as recent as 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, from modern-day India. Some northern Aboriginal Australians and Indians share about 11% of their DNA. Other important clues, such as the presence of foreign animals, like the dingo, and linguistic changes, point to a recent contact with people such as the Austronesians, relatives of the original inhabitants of nearby places, like New Zealand and Hawaii. The Austronesian peoples come from an entirely separate line, originating in East and Southeast Asia. It appears as well, furthermore, that fishermen and sailors of parts of Asia might have been aware of the territory, but scarcely interacted with it. Most curiously, coins from the medieval Islamic world, specifically the Sultanate of Kilwa, have been discovered in Australia, perhaps dating
Coins even. Okay.
to as recently as the 14th century, though no one knows how they got there. Regardless of what the extent of the contact between the first Australians and outside groups was, the Aboriginal Australian people remain, as mentioned, very distinct from any other group on the planet. The people here would develop a large variety of cultural practices, lifestyles, and hundreds of languages. Religious ideas
Hundreds of languages. Oh boy. Not dialects, but actually languages.
were diverse as well, though clearly had a common origin. Many revolve around the concept of the dream time, or the dreaming, the stories pertaining to the spirits and forces which created the earth. They do not believe these events to be exclusively a thing of the past, and have a concept of the every win, meaning that these events pertain to the past, present, and future. I was fortunate enough to have an Australian friend who asked an Aboriginal tribal elder himself about the concept of the every win for me, and his response was that they do not have a linear view of time like Europeans do. They do not see time with beginnings and ends in their religion, but see it more as cyclical. Indeed, a cyclical perspective of time is shared by many non-Abrahamic religions. Many Aboriginal religions hold that the earth began as a flat,
The Uluru. Again.
empty plain, and that the landscape was created by the rainbow snake, known by different names across the continent, such as Goriala, which carved out the landscape as it slithered across it, bringing the oceans and rivers into being as well by bringing water to the world. It is often viewed as the creator of the universe, but not necessarily a god in the sense with which many people from outside of Australia are familiar. It is also not necessarily always a snake, but the association with this being in water is very common. Some of their stories seem to have been passed down orally for thousands of years, some of which, fascinatingly, researchers believe truly describe the island's natural history, such as stories of flooding and changes in the shoreline. Fascinating and complex though these cultures were and are, they would remain largely semi-nomadic, though not fully, as they migrated around specific areas and seem to have developed some forms of agriculture and very effective land management techniques.
So not all of them were nomadic. So they settled at some point in time.
They are classified, due to the fact that they did not develop metalworking, as persisting in the Stone Age until the arrival of the Europeans. Australia supported a population of perhaps 1 million people before European arrival. Later European explorers would note that the natives appeared to be content and happy with their lives, but that periods of hardship and war between tribes did erupt. The Aboriginal peoples did not have the same ideas about land that the Europeans did either, and therefore did not wage wars for the conquest of it, but did fight to administer what they perceived as justice, to take revenge, to dominate other groups, to kidnap women for childbearing, and for reasons like these. For millennia,
Okay. Yeah. Protecting their honor.
with only a handful of exceptions, Australia was overwhelmingly isolated. But one day, this land would change forever when newcomers arrived.
Which one? No, I'm curious. If you forget that we were there.
The educated people of the Old World seem to have believed, since at least the time of the ancients, that there had to be a counterweight to the land in the Northern Hemisphere.
A counterweight. Wow. We had the flat earth believers that the earth is flat. And this was a group that think that there should be a balance, as in, oh wow, I did not know that too. A counterweight.
Meaning that there must be land, a roughly equal amount of it, in the Southern Hemisphere to balance the planet. Keep in mind they had known since the ancient Greeks that the Earth was most likely a globe. They called this mysterious hypothetical land, among many things, Terra Australis Incognita, Latin for the unknown southern land. Various claims were made about this land, where exactly it would be, apart from, south, how to reach it, and what it might even be like. No Roman or Greek had ever set foot in Australia, however, much less Antarctica. This was entirely a guess. Some believed that Africa might extend all the way south, or that the land wrapped around the Indian Ocean entirely. Some felt that
Oh, nice, these drawings and this kind of thinking in those days without actually having any kind of satellite pictures, etc. So really guessing and drawing it up. Good work, good documentary.
because, from the perspective of old world thinkers, heat increases as you move south, that land that far south would be inhospitably hot, or at least that a region of inhospitable temperatures might divide the two hemispheres, thus preventing contact. The idea was revived hundreds of years later in the Renaissance. When the end of Africa was discovered in the age of exploration of the 15th and 16th centuries, many of these theories had to be revised, but many people still held to the belief that such land probably existed, even placing assumptions of what it would look like on early maps.
Yeah, this is already more like the nowadays global maps.
Though based on a faulty assumption about how the planet works, this belief would indeed encourage the discovery of a major southern land. In the 15 and 1600s, Europeans, specifically the Portuguese, Spanish, French, English, and Dutch began to compete for lands beyond their own, including the lucrative islands of Southeast Asia. Of them, it appears that it was the Dutch who first sighted Australia. The Dutch,
Thank you.
propelled by the powerful VOC, or VOC, a Dutch abbreviation for the United East India Company, were heavily involved in the spice trade of the East Indies, a name for these islands of Southeast Asia.
Yeah, and at this old picture, you can see that it's not red, white, and blue, but orange, white, and blue, based on the House of Orange. So only later on it became really red, white, and blue.
It was only a matter of time before their search for further wealth led them to new lands. On February 26, 1606, Willem Janszoon, a Dutch explorer and colonial governor, became the first known European to land on Australia, though it isn't clear if he was the actual first. He may have been preceded by other Europeans, or even the Chinese. He left...
Ooh, the Chinese. But it's not documented. Could be. Coming down from China. It's not that far away.
From here, the island of Java, and landed here, sailing towards the unknown, making landfall on the northern tip of Australia, today Pennefather River. Like Columbus in America, however, he and his men had no idea what exactly they were looking at or standing on. He charted around 200 miles of coastline, but assumed the land was part of the island of New Guinea.
German. Neu-Holland. This is New Guinea. So this is German. It's a German map.
Eventually, he and his men ran into the natives. For one reason or another, this encounter eventually led to violence. 10 Dutchmen and an unknown handful of natives were killed in the first fight between peoples separated for tens of thousands of years.
Yeah. Sorry. I apologize. The VOC, it's such a dark part of our history. They did a lot of good, but they did also a lot of bad.
Janszoon had been sent by the VOC to find economic opportunities in the area. However, he soon left, concluding that it was a swampy land full of savage cannibals, and that there was little in the way of opportunity in this
A swampy land. I don't know. Is that part actually swampy-like?
place. Over the next few decades, other explorers would chart nearby lands and occasionally bump into Australia itself. One of the most important explorers was Abel Tasman, who arrived in 1644.
Yeah.
On his first voyage in the area, in which he and his men nearly died, he did not reach Australia itself, but did discover the island of Tasmania, which he called Van Diemen's Land, but which was, of course, 200 years later, named after him, as well as Fiji and New Zealand, the latter of which he believed was the mainland of the Terra Australis Incognita itself.
Aha, okay. Because New Zealand is a province over here in the Netherlands. So it's named after one of our own provinces.
On his second voyage, he did reach Australia, extensively mapping its western coastline, naming it after a region in his own country, New Holland. For the next century, European explorers, most of them Dutch, would continue to both intentionally and unintentionally bump into Australia, though in truth not a heavy amount of attention was paid to it. Viewing it as an inhospitable land, they would not attempt to colonize it. It was not until the end of the 18th century that the first Europeans would really try. They would succeed in placing Australia on a new destiny towards the formation of its modern nationhood.
Part 3. The colonization of Australia.
1768. Britain has recently defeated its main rival, France, in the 7 Years' War, seeing success against them in North America, where it is known as the French and Indian War, Europe, and in India. It is a great victory, but was not a total victory. Britain's rivals, primarily France, remain powerful challengers, and worse, its relationship with its North American colonies appears increasingly tenuous. To maintain its empire and success as a nation, Britain feels it must continue exploring, colonizing, and conquering. It was in that year that an English lieutenant in the Royal Navy, who was observing the transit of the planet Venus, James Cook, received orders from the British government to go off in search of the Terra Australis Incognita and settle the issue once and for all. It would be very difficult for him to find, primarily because it did not exist, but he did explore the second closest thing to it. In 1770, he reached New Zealand, and then afterwards, Australia. He would explore much of the east coast, briefly coming into contact with the natives and finding them hostile. Because there was no agricultural development, he felt that the territory could be claimed for Britain, and so he claimed the eastern half of the whole island, calling it New South Wales. He then returned to Britain itself and informed the British government that he had come from a land down under, where women glow and men plunder. Can't you hear? Can't you hear the thunder? You better run. You better take cover. To which King George III, of course, replied, "What?" Cook then explained that it was from a song which would be written in about 200 years. George III then replied, "Giraffes." This was because he was mad. But his ministers understood the situation. Moving on, while Cook was away, the French had arrived on the scene, and had claimed the western half of the island for France. Feeling pressured, the British would send Cook 2 more times to explore the South Pacific. He and his expedition passed by Tasmania twice, but did not land in Australia itself again. In fact, Cook would never see Australia again, as he was killed in 1779 on his 3rd voyage while in Hawaii. His discoveries would be of major importance to the British and would change the future of the island forever. The search for Terra Australis Incognita began to come to an end after it was concluded that such a land would likely be frozen and inhospitable if it did exist. The focus, in this regard, was now on Australia and New Zealand. Events abroad would push Britain further towards Australia. The American War of Independence ended officially in 1783, with the British facing defeat and being forced to recognize their nationhood, thereby giving up some very profitable colonies. The 13 colonies were many things to the British. Among them, it was a place to put their prisoners. The prisoners sent to America, however, were not necessarily really all just the dregs of society, but rather many were thrown in prison for things such as accruing debts, very minor crimes, or in some circumstances, notably Irish circumstances, rebelling against authority. Many of those chosen to go off to the New World had important skills which would be useful there, which is why Britain invested so much in shipping them halfway around the world. It was through an effort to help colonize and develop America that these individuals could pay their debts off. A few years later, in 1786, the British decided to direct these efforts towards the new land of Australia. Contrary to popular jokes and myth, only a small fraction of the eventual settlers in Australia were prisoners. Although, the penal colonies established on the island would be important to its development, and for now, they would be the majority. The colonies in Australia were more about strategic and economic importance than they were about simply having a place to dump their prisoners. Were these prisoners not useful to colonial efforts, these far-off penal colonies would not have been worth it. The French never followed through with their intentions to colonize Australia. Even if they had wanted to, they were soon sidelined by guillotines and Corsican generals. The Swedish also even considered forming a colony on the island near modern-day Perth, but they too abandoned their plans for it. The British were even concerned, at one point, that the United States might attempt to claim a part of the island. It is interesting to consider what might have happened if Australia were a country which would have been divided between different powers, but that, ultimately, was not the island's fate. It was Britain.
Looks interesting. Americans, red, white, and blue, so the Dutch, and the Norwegians, French, and then the Brits. Would have looked interesting.
But that, ultimately, was not the island's fate. It was Britain who braved the challenges posed by the continent, and Britain who would reap the rewards of its investment. In 1788, Britain went forth to colonize Australia. On January 26th of that year, a fleet of 11 ships containing over 1,000 people, known as the First Fleet, led by Captain Arthur Phillip, landed in Sydney Cove near Botany Bay, which was suggested by Cook and his crew members themselves, with the intention of establishing a settlement. The majority of them were convicts, and of the convicts, about 3/4 were male. January 26th is today, accordingly, commemorated as Australia Day, the beginning of the modern nation's development. Governor Phillip's orders
7th of January, did you say?
were male. January 26th is today,
26th,
accordingly,
okay.
commemorated as Australia Day, the beginning of the modern nation's development. Governor Phillip's orders were to establish a colony, discipline the prisoner population, and attempt to secure what were described as peaceful and harmonious relations with the natives. The settlers quickly came into contact with the natives and found that there was plenty of opportunity for misunderstanding. In one incident even, Phillip was stabbed in the shoulder by a native tribesman over a misunderstanding, but retained such self-discipline that he ordered his men not to retaliate, threatening to hang anyone who killed a native. Ultimately, however, conflict would come. Life in the colony soon proved to be less than ideal. Developing and settling the land was difficult. The prisoners sent to the island, though they were worked intensely, were too unskilled and unfamiliar with the land and its climate to build a successful colony. Britain itself was half a world away and could not speedily assist them. Disease ravaged the populace. They found some of the natives, furthermore, to be hostile towards their efforts. There were no representative assemblies for the moment, and the governor acted with supreme authority, being harsh on the colonists to prevent the settlement from falling apart. Many began to wonder if colonizing New Holland would even be possible, let alone fruitful.
So they still call it New Holland at that point. They did not rename it but they renamed the province as being New South Wales, but not the entire continent.
Over the years, however, a few thousand more people, many of them convicts, continued to arrive to Sydney, bringing supplies and enhancing the colony's odds of survival. In the 1790s, free settlers began to arrive in larger numbers, and were joined by emancipated convicts in settling the landscape. Settlements began to grow and spread as the British better explored and understood the world around them. The British would soon realize that holding hundreds of convicts and former rebels all in the same area was bound to cause trouble. In March of 1804, a group of Irish insurgents rebelled against British authority and planned to capture a handful of ships with which to sail back to Ireland. They met the British Army at the Second Battle of Vinegar Hill, the first having taken place in Ireland itself, and were crushed. It would not be the last uprising with which the authorities would have to contend. 4 years later, in 1808, the governor of New South Wales, William Bligh, was deposed by the military in the Rum Rebellion, instigated by famous figures such as John MacArthur. It was also in 1804 that the navigator Matthew Flinders, quite Britishly, suggested that the name of New Holland be replaced, and that the island should simply be called Australia, after the old mythical land of the ancients. The name caught on over the next few decades, and the name New Holland quickly fell into the past. By 1808, around 10,000 Europeans lived in Australia. A decade later, in 1818, the number had grown to 25,000, and in 1828, about 60,000. They moved to settlements along with Sydney like Newcastle, Launceston in Tasmania, Moreton Bay, which became Brisbane, and more. In 1827, fearing European rivals, the British claimed the whole of Australia, calling the new territory West Australia, and established the settlement of Albany there. Perth was founded in 1829, Melbourne in 1835, and Adelaide in 1836. Quality of life improved for the colonists, however, this was not quite as much the case for the Aboriginal Australians. There was a significant amount of cooperation and segregated coexistence between the Aboriginal tribes and settlers, but further expansion into the region inevitably led to war. The Australian Frontier Wars, as they are known, referring to a number of separate disputes and conflicts, would last throughout the 19th century, and even into the 20th century. Overall, over 2,000
Into the 20th century even. Wow.
European colonists, and a heavily debated number of Aboriginal Australians, with estimates ranging from as low as 20,000 to well over 100,000, were killed in the fighting. To make matters worse, the Europeans, unknowingly, introduced diseases to the Aboriginal populations to which they had no resistance, such
What's happening all over the YouTube? I can think what's happening here, but this is, of course, yeah, half-naked people.
Such as smallpox, tuberculosis, and influenza, killing many, many more. Fighting would be the most intense in the southeast of the continent, as population
It happened in South America, the same also disease brought over from Europe that there was no resistance at. So, yeah.
of both groups were the highest there. The first major war would be the Black War in Tasmania, which lasted until 1832. Though brave warriors, Aboriginal Australians stood little chance against the British soldiers, who had advanced training, weapons, and also had experience in combat. Eventually, many would be placed on reservations or with Christian missions. Others would attempt to integrate into the European Australian society as farmhands or other laborers. Conditions began to relax somewhat in the colonies. The government began to expand and allowed the residents of the island more representation in their government. One of the primary concerns of the citizens of Australia was an end to the convictism of their country. They found the importation of convicts disagreeable and felt that the forced labor too closely resembled slavery. From the 1840s onward, convict deportation to Australia began to slow, with the final convict ship sent to Australia arriving in Tasmania in 1868. Industries were founded, such as the wool industry, which, though they struggled at first, would empower Australia in the decades to come. In 1851, gold was discovered. This discovery would be of major importance to Australian history. It marked the beginning of the aptly named Australian gold rushes, which would last from 1851 to 1914. These gold rushes would be immensely successful and would lead to waves of non-convict settlers from Europe, including 2% of Britain and Ireland's population, as well as people from North America and even some from China. Hundreds of thousands would flood into Australia, largely into Victoria, where the rush began. Tension would quickly grow between the miners and government of Victoria, which taxed and regulated their activity heavily, eventually breaking into all-out conflict between them. The miners organized the Eureka Rebellion, creating a flag based off of the constellation of the Southern Cross and pledging allegiance to it, promising to fight to end the government's license fee and for the vote for all men, regardless of income, as the vote at this time was contingent upon owning £1,000 worth of property. The government was open to the latter, but not the former. The rebels fought government forces at the Battle of the Eureka Stockade on the 3rd of December, 1854. The rebels were defeated by the army, but having the support of the populace, faced few repercussions. In fact, the government would even grant many of the rebels' demands soon after. That had been settled for the moment, but there was still further crime and disorder. The scene in Australia, for a time, was quite similar to the one of America's Wild West, with bushrangers, as they are known, roaming the countryside, robbing banks and travelers, and engaging in all manner of illegal activity. There was to be ethnic tension as well, stemming from the populations of mining immigrants, specifically with a concern over growing Chinese populations. Though faced with conflicts like these, Australia overall began to prosper. By 1860, Australia, excluding the Aboriginal Australians, had a population of over 1 million people, mostly with ancestry from Britain and Ireland. The states and territories which exist today in Australia were taking shape in the administrative borders of these separate colonies. Western Australia, the Northern Territory, which at this time was governed by South Australia, Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, and Tasmania. New Zealand had become a separate colony in 1840. These were separate colonies with separate governments and responsibilities, but members, of course, of the same country.
Now I see New Caledonia as being France.
Britain itself allowed the Australians a fair degree of autonomy, but still managed them to a degree, maintaining a military presence and overseeing their diplomatic relations. Despite its exotic location, Australia itself was seen as an extension of Britain and its people, and their culture, language, and beliefs. As we've seen, it was, in many ways, Britain's Wild West. In 1870, most of the British Army withdrew from Australia, thus making the colonies responsible for their own defense. By 1880, the Australian population had grown to over 2 million, and a decade later, 3 million, with Melbourne.
Wait. The map changed over here. I see Germany arising there. So part of it is red, so Australian or British. And then a part became, as in KWI or KWL, KWI or KWL, Germany. And we still have the Dutch Indies. Yeah. What happened there?
Population had grown to over 2 million, and a decade later, 3 million, with Melbourne temporarily becoming the second largest city in the British Empire, the world's largest empire, after, of course, London itself. And
yeah, you see, the British Empire was everywhere. All the time, all over, you see the Union Jack. Yep, the Commonwealth.
some argued that it was the richest city in the world. The island and its economic booming attracted thousands and thousands of newcomers, though Australia would soon, gradually, put into effect a number of policies to reduce or even forbid non-European immigrants, referred to by historians as the White Australia policy. These policies
non-Europeans immigrants. So, yeah, non-Europeans. Okay.
would extend towards the Aboriginals in the 20th century, leading to the stolen generations, referring to a practice of mixed European and Aboriginal children being taken from their parents and brought up by Australian officials in an attempt to bring them up in a modernized society. In the 1890s, Australia faced a massive economic crash which caused grievances and ideas kept at bay by the stability to flare. Australia had now been a British colony for a little over a century, and its inhabitants now spoke more openly of political reform and even federation, or in other words, unity and self-government. Australia was quite liberal for the time. By 1896, all of the colonies had granted suffrage to men over the age of 21, and in some circumstances, women and Aboriginal men. However, many Australians felt that these rights were not sufficient. Along with being encouraged to reform things by the economic conditions of the day, there were nationalistic concerns as well. French and German expansion into the South Pacific was concerning and encouraged this idea of unity further. In 1883, despite Australian attempts to stop them, which the British forbade, Germany annexed modern-day Papua New Guinea. This made the Australian people consider the prospect of forming a united Australia.
Oh, they annexed Papua New Guinea. So, my Western neighbors weren't that nice too.
Australian army, but that would require a united Australian government. Furthermore, by about 1880, for the first time, the majority of Australians had been born in Australia, leading to a much more developed national identity. One of the most outspoken proponents of federation was Sir Henry Parkes, who sought to, as he claimed, build an Australian nation without breaking ties to the mother nation. It was not so much Britain who was hesitant about the idea, however, as they had already allowed the Australians a good degree of self-rule, but in fact other Australians who had reservations. Certain colonies, like New South Wales, feared the potential dominance of others, such as Victoria, which would be disadvantageous to their interests. There were other concerns as well, such as disagreements over certain laws and economic policies. There was a hope that Australia could one day be a nation comparable to what the United States was becoming, an industrial powerhouse descended from the British Empire, albeit
in this layer where you see how large both continents are, and so yeah.
having separated less peacefully, home to millions and millions of people. However, there were also fears that, if they got it wrong, Australia could, like the United States, face a civil war. In 1899, after years of campaigning, constitutional conventions, and negotiations, an Australian constitution was signed by most of the member states, and was joined by all of them in 1900 when West Australia joined. New Zealand and Fiji did not participate, and thus embarked on a path to become separate nations. The British approved, and on the first day of the 20th century, Australia became a new nation. It still recognized the British monarch, Queen Victoria, as their head of state, and remained proud members of the British Empire, but had their own parliament, prime minister, and a large amount of home rule, though the British government still had a say in some affairs there. Australia's first prime minister was Edmund Barton, who held the office from 1901 to 1903. The choice for the capital city was debated, with some favoring Melbourne and others Sydney. A compromise was reached, however, and the city in between the two, Canberra, was made and remains Australia's capital. And thus, after over a century of work, struggle, and progress, a nation was born. Australia's greatest challenges, however, had yet to come.
Part 4, the baptism of fire.
In 1914, tension between the major powers of Europe erupted into the most major war
World War I, yeah?
seen not simply within the past relatively peaceful century, but in all of human history to that date. The First World War. Britain, France, and Russia united against Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. As we've seen, Australians, due to their somewhat isolated position on the globe, did not participate much in many of the conflicts fought by the British Empire. This war, however, would be different. As a true world war, it would affect the whole world to some extent, Australia included, both abroad, as the British mustered the strength from all their dominions, and closer to home, as territory in the Pacific became contested. When Britain declared war, Australia was automatically included. Australia's entry into the war was known as their baptism of fire. The Australian mindset and identity would never be the same again. Despite the origins of the conflict being half a world away, Australians enthusiastically rallied to join the cause. Nearly 500,000 Australian men would volunteer between 1914 and 18 to defend the mother country, possibly as much as half of the fighting age population at the time. A remarkable number, given Australia's avoidance of conscription. Together with New Zealand, they formed the world-renowned ANZAC, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. Their first task was to seize German New Guinea and the surrounding islands, displayed here. Within months, Australia and New Zealand had seized many of the islands, with the Empire of Japan seizing many of the others. The German forces present in the Pacific surrendered and showed much less effort to maintain their holdings. Undoubtedly, Australia...
Yeah, that far away from Germany itself, it's impossible.
Australia's most famous contribution, however, would be the Gallipoli Campaign. As the war dragged on in Europe, the world watched each side struggle to make significant progress against the other. Accordingly, the Allied forces sought to open a second front and assist the Russians in their fight against the Ottomans. In 1915, a plan was hatched to land forces here on the Gallipoli Peninsula, not far from the Ottoman capital of Istanbul. If this could be done,
I was looking at what is water and what is land, but the gray is water. Aegean Sea, Sea of Marmara, and the Black Sea.
Would quickly break Ottoman power in the region. On February 17th of that year, the Gallipoli campaign began. It would last for 8 months and be carried out on the Allied side by the Anzacs along with Anglo-Indian, Canadian, and French assistance. The fighting here was famously brutal, and, due to strategic error and fierce Ottoman resistance, would fail, with over 8,000 Australians among the over 30,000 allies who perished in the fighting.
Wow. Australians fought on the European continent for the freedom of, for the first time, by the way. Second World War, they did it again, but...
Australian imperial forces were subsequently withdrawn from the fighting and transported to other fronts, namely France, where they joined the other allies in their horrendous, endless fight against the Germans, such as in the upcoming Somme offensive, and in the Middle East, pursuing other activity against the Ottomans in the Sinai and Palestine campaign. The war ended in 1918 with Allied, and therefore Australian, victory. Overall, around 60,000.
Wait a minute. This is a kangaroo. And this is the Egypt pyramids. So they brought along, I guess, fresh meat? That's why I see a roo in this picture.
And therefore Australian victory. Overall, around 60,000 Australians were killed in the fighting, and thousands more were severely scarred both mentally and physically for the rest of their lives. Australian Prime Minister Billy Hughes would be active in the Treaty of Versailles, the first international treaty signed by Australia. He would side with Britain on punishing Germany and blaming them for the war, aiming to secure territory from them in the Pacific. Indeed, was granted to Australia in the League of Nations mandates. In fact, all German colonial territory was granted to the Allied powers. However, much of the German Pacific territory was also given to another nation who was making its presence felt in the Pacific. As mentioned, Japan, which Hughes did not agree with. Britain had attempted to maintain cordial relations with the Japanese, but the Australians, neighboring this newly expanding empire, were reluctant to welcome them further into the Pacific. For now, peace had come, but one day, Japan would be a threat. The interwar years in Australia would unfold much the same as they did in North America and Europe. The Roaring Twenties was a decade of cultural changes, technological development, and relative prosperity, which were succeeded by the hardships of the Great Depression in the 30s. Yeah. As Australia struggled to come out of the economic decline, unemployment levels reached as high as almost 30% in 1932. It was also in 1932 that one of Australia's most famous historical events took place, the Emu War, or as my beloved Australian viewers will insist I pronounce it, Emu War.
Yeah, I was corrected on this one also many times. I now know, it's emu.
This war has been very heavily memed. It was essentially a pest control operation.
Yeah, it was not even a war. That's what some of my commenters also said. It's a slaughter. It's man with a gun versus an unarmed bird. So it's it's not a war. It's technically just a slaughter. Yeah.
Emus wreaked havoc on Australian agriculture to the point at which the military was sent to handle the situation, which ended in a failure. I won't engage in the Emu War silliness because the Emu War was a proxy war. It's an illusion. You've all been lied to. It distracts from the real threat posed by the monastic state of the Australian rabbit, led by their immortal god emperor, who is known to the kids these days, as well as people on Reddit, as,
It's the bunny. Oh boy. Yeah, but this was what I knew. I know about the rabbit disease, but I did not know about the Emu War. I did not, but this is something that came up in my history lessons also, as the rabbits are a real pest in Australia because the lack of natural enemies. So, yeah. But he's making it a joke again.
Well, they call him Big Chungus. It was in the late 1930s that a new, far greater threat appeared on the Australian horizon.
Yeah.
The prospect of a second Great War. Relations with both Germany and Japan began to break down in the 30s as both sides overtly displayed their imperial ambitions. As mentioned, to the Australians, Japan posed the most significant threat. Its ambitions of expanding throughout Asia, including their secret intention to expel the European powers from the region, would inevitably clash with the ambitions of the British Empire. Japanese ambitions could spread quite far throughout the Pacific, perhaps even to Australia itself. In 1939, war did indeed come, as Australia was tied to Britain's declaration. The extent to which I can discuss this war is of course limited by YouTube's demonetization practices, so I will unfortunately not be able to mention certain key events. However, the majority of those events were in Europe, and as mentioned, Australia was most...
What? Because of the restriction of YouTube? You cannot mention certain events in Europe? It's history. because of certain words, I can imagine, but
was threatened by Japan. Japan's key focus was on the area of Indochina, which included the territory of British Malaya, modern Indonesia, then controlled by the Dutch, Papua New Guinea, which was administered by Australia, and possibly, at some point, the Philippines, which was...
yeah, and in the Dutch Indies is where my dad fought against the Japanese. So that's what my history is about. So I'm interested in, because my dad was there fighting the Japs.
was protected by the United States. With the Japanese advancing rapidly into these areas, the Australians were reluctant to deploy further troops to assist in the European and North African theater to assist against Germany, with thousands already present fighting in the Mediterranean. The war quickly became quite serious. Eventually, the British and their colonies stood alone against the Axis powers. Then, Japan switched focus and attacked the United States. A few months later, in February of '42, British-held Singapore, partially defended by Australian forces, fell to the Japanese. Australian Prime Minister John Curtin feared that an invasion of Australia could be next. In fact, the Australian city of Darwin was bombed by Japanese aircraft that same month. It was the first time Australia itself had been attacked by a foreign power. The bombing would continue until late '43. Abroad, the Japanese would fight Australian forces ferociously and be exceedingly brutal towards Australian prisoners. The Japanese never landed troops in Australia, though, and in fact, never attempted to expand into Australia itself. It was considered unfeasible, as they strained to defend their empire from the Americans, who were pressing further into their Pacific territory. Their invasion of Australian territory was limited to New Guinea, where they attempted to take Port Moresby. Their invasion was halted by American forces at sea and by Australian and American forces on the land in grueling jungle warfare. With Britain having been badly defeated in the Pacific, the Australians looked to coordinate their efforts more closely with the Americans, which was the beginning of a closer, positive relationship between the two nations. In fact, Australian forces were soon put under the command of American General Douglas MacArthur. In '45, the Germans and, months later, the Japanese surrendered to Allied forces. Overall, about 40,000 Australians had died in the war. The majority
after 2 nuclear bombs
of them having died in the Pacific. It was the most brutal war that Australia and the world had ever seen, but the nation once more came out standing. Following these events, Australia began to enter the modern world, where the lines between history and modernity are blurred. It was after the war that the British Empire began to fall apart, a process which would have a notable effect on Australia. Colonies and territories around the world were given more or total independence. In 1975, Papua New Guinea gained its independence. In 1986, in Australia herself, British legal authority came to an end with the Australia Act 1986.
Yeah, 1986, that's what I saw, because we're talking about 1901, but the real independence was then at 1986, so it's only a couple of years, couple of centuries, decades, not centuries, a couple of decades.
Australia thus became a true, fully independent country, though it does remain a part of the British Commonwealth, and the British monarch ceremonially remains the Australian head of state. As we've seen, Australia is quite a young nation in the grand scheme of things. It was heavily isolated for most of history until just 240 years ago, and the nation itself is only a bit over 100 years old. However, in that time, the nation has experienced a remarkable history and has made an undeniable impact on the world. It's a complicated story with numerous examples of hardship and misfortune and suffering. Yet the Australian story is as well one of great success, which speaks to the strength and determination of the Australian people, traits
and their pride,
which will doubtlessly continue to fuel the nation and grant it a bright future. Before we wrap up, I'd like to say a couple things. Firstly, I was fortunate enough to have some Australian Discord friends volunteer to give me their input on their history for the making of this video. One of whom is a fellow YouTuber, Richie Richgold, who runs a gaming channel of the same name. I'll drop a
Yeah, okay. He had a lot of help, from the Aussies to make it a realistic and more accurate video as possible. So, yeah. Wow. Good video. Not much to comment on because this is pure history lessons, pure getting into my brain and trying to remember. It will take some time to actually give it all the right places in my brain, but yeah, good video. I hope you liked this too. And if you did, then press like. And if you want to see other of my reaction videos, more active reaction videos than this one, then this is a good place to start with. And otherwise, it would be really appreciated if you hit the subscribe button. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.